Hello, comrades. My name is Travis, and I host the Aura of Greatness podcast. My podcast explores history through the lens of historical figures. I try to figure out what it was like for these individuals as they rose to fame, and then discuss their impact on the world around them. I do this by delving into their family background, sharing the history of the places around them, discussing events from their childhood, analyzing the different moments throughout their formative years that shaped their worldview, and then penetrating their famous moments with the knowledge that the aura around them came from a very human place. I'm currently on my first series in exploring the life of Ernesto Che Guevara. Very soon in my narrative, Che will be bursting onto the scene of the Cold War. You have already ventured across the eastern border. After listening to this episode, come on down to Central and South America. Now, without further ado, enjoy this episode of the Eastern Border Podcast.
Greetings, comrades, and welcome to the Eastern Border. In this episode, we shall be dedicating our attention to KGB. This is the second part of our series on gulags, gulag system, and the punishment in general in the Soviet Union. And last time we spoke about the history of exiling people, of putting them into these prison camps and everything, but let's just start at the point where everything began. That is, you getting arrested, which might be a quite unpleasant experience if you think about it. Before that, I have a small announcement to make that I recently did a poll on Twitter and Facebook about which book should I read to my Patreon subscribers, chapter by chapter. And by quite a large margin, Anna Politkovskaya's Russian Diaries won, and the second place was The Wizard of the Emerald City, that is the Soviet ripoff of The Wizard of Oz. So these two books shall be read in order, starting with the Russian Diaries, then The Wizard of Oz. And if you want to hear any of those, you become my Patreon subscriber. Also, we will probably be incorporating PDRP feed into this one, because since we have moved this feed to Acast, we have had some difficulties on making the other feed to work. So unfortunately, we shall have to incorporate PDRP into this feed permanently. Now, this is not much of a problem, as most of you, as far as I know, like PDRP. Well, if you don't, you can just skip over it and not listen to these episodes. I hope you won't get too angry. But yeah, I'm thinking that this is going to happen unless I can figure some way how to make this work otherwise. But yeah, anyways, this episode is all about KGB, all about arresting people, all about how the arrests were made and what happened to you while you were under their control. Anyway, the history of the KGB itself. At the beginning, this is why we call them, all of them, Cheka. Why they're known as Chekists and everything. Because that was the first Soviet security organization. See, in December of 1917, the Cheka, which was an acronym for the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, was established. This is the birth date. By 1918, the rule of the die-hard Polish Bolshevik Felix Dzerzhinsky in Cheka ensured that this organization became the most feared institution in the whole Russian Civil War at the time, because during then the war was still going on. In 1922, when the war was about to end, the Cheka was reorganized under the organization known as the GPU. Soon, it changed to OGPU. Basically, that was another Государственная безопасность, basically government security organization anyways. This founding father, this Felix Dzerzhinsky, he died in 1926, technically because of natural causes. He had statues placed all over the place, including the Red Square, until 1981. He was in all the children's books. He was like a national hero and a definite proof why the Polish people should be in the in the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, because obviously Felix Dzerzhinsky, he was the greatest man ever to live. He is the person who got rid of all the national enemies that the Soviet Union had. And, well, he's created secret police, everything that he had made, which was Czech at the time. As Stalin gained power, they gained crazy amounts of control and power in the nation. As you learned the previous episode, by 1929, Stalin had decided to liquidate the kulak, the rich farmer, as a class, as they weren't inclined to join the kolkhoz. And he really hoped to destroy especially Ukrainian nationalistic feelings by this, because Ukrainians didn't get their independence like we did. They got dragged into this Soviet Union. So he aimed at the special repercussions in Ukraine to just break them. Collectivization and forced famine began there. See, this is the beginning of the Holodomor, the famous case where Stalin just took away insane amounts of grain and murdered a large amount of people. Like I said, it's a forced famine and it's one of the worst crimes ever. Anyway, about 1 million of Ukrainians were deported by these OGPU agents to Siberia or sent to gulags. Hundreds of thousands were executed, even for the slightest resistance, and this is where the Pablo Morozov story comes in. In 1933, Stalin caused a forced famine there that killed millions. It is estimated by modern historians that 14.5 million died from 1929 to 1933 as a result of these collectivization policies that Stalin introduced. In 1934, the OGPU was reorganized under our very well-known acronym that we have used a lot previously, the NKVD. Again, just for those of you who have forgotten, it's People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. Stalin gave it unrestricted control, and the organization was to be responsible only to himself. That is, it was responsible to no one else but Stalin, and Stalin used it as his personal extermination tool. At its head at that time was Genrik Yakoda, and my sources call him a spiteful and evil man, and I tend to agree. And in December 1934, the terror, the Great Red Terror, that previously was somewhat unknown to the masses, well, if you exclude the forced starvation, it really began. Sergei Kirov, a confidant of Stalin, like I mentioned previously, I'm just going to go into a bit more detail here. Sergei Kirov was assassinated. He was also a Leningrad party chief, and most likely, my sources say, it was done probably by Stalin himself. Because Stalin used Kirov's death as a pretext to launch his wildly known Reign of Terror. This Reign of Terror would last until 1939. In the last month of 1934, nearly 1,000 people who were thought to have a connection with the Kirov plot were shot by the NKVD. Thousands more were deported to gulag camps of Siberia, which were, as you know already, also run by the NKVD. And this whole thing was just basically an intro to the Great Full Terror beginning in 1936. Party comrades of this Kirov, Zinoviev and Kamenev, were the first to be executed. The NKVD, they targeted many other party members of the upper echelons. Yagoda, the leader at the time, himself was purged for irrational reasons, really, just crazy ones. His wife having had a part of a plot to overthrow Soviet Union and other nonsense, basically. He was killed because he needed to be killed. And he was replaced by a 5-foot-tall Nikolai Yezhov, which, as we know from last episode, was widely known as the Bloody Dwarf. Other name which I found since the last episode was his era would be called Yezhovshchina, or the time of Yezhov. That was just crazy, because he was responsible for a lot of deaths and a lot of this punishment going on. And this is a short history, so I won't go into too much detail, but still. Yezhov managed to be almost as bloody as Stalin himself. You see, Jagoda, the previous leader, was executed and Jeżew was given free rein by Stalin himself in 1937. That's when the terror had reached its height already. The NKVD arrested and shot millions of the whole upper officer corps, and it was just purged of everything. In 1938, Jeżew himself was replaced by Lavrentiy Beria, who was a close friend of Stalin. Beria purged the NKVD itself, as had Jeżew before him, and obviously he saw to the fact that Jeżew was shot. By 1946, the NKVD was reorganized again, and it happened many times more, until it was known under the all too familiar abbreviation of KGB. Its duties and methods remained about the same until the deaths of Beria and Stalin in 1953. Premier Nikita Khrushchev kind of deprived it of a lot of privileges that it had, and terror was no longer used as a political method, but the memory of it would kind of haunt the people forever. Now, let's go back in the beginning, the history of this NKVD. This Cheka, or the Vecheka, was created in the 20th December 1917. This was, again, known as the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. That's what the Cheka is known. The NKVD, again, had been formed in 1918 to control the police department, criminal investigation departments, fire brigades, internal troops, and prison guards. With the end of the Civil War in the 1922 and the resulting period of stabilization, the Cheka was transformed. On the 8th February 1922, they were formed into the GPU, which is the State Political Directorate, from which all the commissars came, which was then subordinated to the NKVD. With the formation of the USSR in 1923, because officially it formed only then, the GPU became the OGPU, the Unified State Political Directorate, and was upgraded to an independent directorate of the Soviet Council of People's Commissars. Basically, that means it was removed from NKVD control and was kind of separated from it for a while. In 1934, this OJPU was transformed into the GUGB, which is the Chief's Directorate of the State Security, which was again subordinated into the new, all-union NKVD. This kind of marks the beginning of this Soviet state security's most powerful and autocratic period. All key aspects of the internal and state security were now straight subordinated into this one body under one leader. And like I said previously, Jagoda, Jeżew, and finally, from 25th November 1938, Lavrentiy Beria. When we look at how the NKVD was organized, this great organization, in 1934, where its kind of the main terror roots come, was organized like this. There was the GUGB, which is the Chief Directorate of State Security, the GUPVO, the Chief Directorate of Frontier Guards and Interior Troops, our famous Gulag, Chief Directorate of Camps, so to speak, education camps, fun stuff. Mind asbestos, have fun all day long, nothing to do, haha, lol. Except not really, as you already know. Anyways, further on, GUM, Chief Directorate of Militia, and some other units responsible for firefighting, local anti-aircraft defense, highway construction, archives, and so on. Basically, NKVD at this time, which would grow to KGB, was responsible for most weird services, most weird stuff going on. For the control of services, for the control of public sector in general, for the policing of clerks, policing of everyone going on around there. It's kind of interesting because it's like FBI, except they control the libraries too, and, they can just go into a library and shoot someone. On the 2nd of February, 1939, the GUPVO was divided into 6 chief directorates. GUPV, which was the Chief Directorate of Frontier Guards, GUKV, Chief Directorate of Convoy Troops, and now comes the crazy one, GUVOVPGO, which meant Chief Directorate of Troops for Guarding Industry and State Facilities. Then again, later came GUJV, Chief Directorate of NKVD Railroad Troops. And just imagine you have your own official railroad troops. I'm just reading you all these nice names to understand how thoroughly KGB had control over anything. I mean, they were responsible for convoying army troops. They were responsible for guards of industry and state facilities. They were guarding the railroads. And as it goes on, GU-INJV, Chief Directorate of NKVD Engineer Troops. Or GU-INTV, Chief Directorate of the NKVD Intendant's Service. And, of course, GUOV, Chief Directorate of the Operational Forces. Essentially, if you were an army part, you would have NKVD accompanying you. You would have guys which were from these directorates who would sit there and just look at how you do your work everywhere. They had authority over literally everyone. Why? Because that's how it operated. Imagine this, you have a secret service which is responsible only to Stalin by this point. They are everywhere. If you are becoming an engineer, a military engineer or just a civil engineer, you'll have NKVD guys there. Because NKVD manages to become responsible for literally everything. And it gets kind of crazy from there, especially when you think about this Directorate for Troops of Guarding Industry and State Facilities. If you're a mall cop, if you're just a guard somewhere, yeah, you're still under the NKVD jurisdiction, which would later become KGB. On February the 3rd, 1941, Decree 194 of the CPSU Politburo removed this GUGB, which is, again, because you might have forgotten, Chief Directorate of State Security. They removed it from the NKVD and elevated to equaling People's Commissariat status, creating the NKGB. The NKGB was led by certain Merkulyov, which was Beria's former deputy, who basically remained a loyal lackey to Stalin. The new NKGB was responsible for external espionage, counter-espionage throughout the USSR, which were basically operations to find and liquidate anti-Soviet parties and counter-revolutionary formations in the Soviet Union. They were also tasked with guarding leaders of the party and of the state, which were the same. The NKGB organization was then created basically at all levels of the party, starting from all union, down to oblast, down to krai, down to rayon, which are several administrative divisions of this. So this is when the NKGB, which would later then turn into KGB, separated from the NKVD, and other functions of NKVD kind of remained, because KGB took over this security situation here. They took the core part of NKVD and left NKVD with everything else, being responsible for gulags, being responsible for firefighters, guards, just taking political control. KGB now, they were the chief security guys. And that meant that they basically had authority even somewhat over the NKVD itself. Because these were the NKGB at this point. They were already your very well-known dudes in leather coats, wearing these black leather gloves so that the blood can be easily smeared off of them. And they were the guys who'd arrest you while you sleep. This NKGB was later divided into 4 separate sections. First was UR, which was Directorate of Intelligence. Управление разведывательное. Then there was UK, nothing to do with Great Britain, it was the Directorate of Counterintelligence. Управление контрразведывательное. Then there was USP, Secret Political Directorate, which was basically the guys who did most of arresting. And then there was the UNMK, Directorate of the Commandant of the Moscow Kremlin. UKMK were the guys who were guarding Stalin personally. At one point, on late June 1941, after the German invasion, this NKGB was back again resubordinated to the NKVD, as the GUGB sort of ensure closer control of nation's security apparatus during the chaotic time, because at one point, this idea that we have like this general control organization, and then we have this NKGB which controls which controlled the controllers, like in that movie, Who Watches the Watchman? Well, KGB watches the Watchman. Well, obviously. It kind of fell down as the Germans invaded. The Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and in KGB, this fledgling organization, I'm talking about it like a baby, but yeah, this dreadful organization was incorporated back into the NKVD. In April 1943, after the military situation had kind of changed in the favor of the Soviet Union, the GUGB was again removed from the NKVD and became the NKGB once again. This time, the change lasted until the birth of the MGB in 1946. See, in the March of that year, 1946, the Soviet government was again restructured, and all people's commissariats were redesigned into ministries. Because previously, the Soviet Union didn't have any ministries as we know it in the modern world. They only had people's commissariats. But Stalin decided that, enough power in some people's hands is enough. Let us just reorganize everything and take power away from the army. Thus, NKVD became the MVD, and NKGB became the MGB. Merkulyov, as the head of this organization, was replaced by the new MGB. Merkulyov was replaced as the head of this new MGB by certain Abakumov. Kruglov replaced Beria as the head of the MVD, and Beria himself by this point became a full member of the Soviet Politburo and a deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, exercising, thus, complete and full control over both the MVD, this general guarding organization, over the firefighters, the clerks and everything, and MGB, which was controlling that other organization and were responsible for spying, counterintelligence, and arresting people. On the 6th of March, 1953, the day after Stalin died, Beria succeeded in uniting the MVD and MJB into one body, the MVD, again. On 13th March 1954, after Beria himself was killed, and after his so-called secret trial and further on execution, this huge government-controlling apparatus, the Ministry of Truth, if you want to name it that way, this MVD was again split up. The reformed MVD retained its traditional policing and internal security functions, while the new KGB took on the state security functions of the MGB. The KGB was now only subordinated to the USSR Council of Ministers, the Soviet Cabinet. And this day is when we can speak about the very beginning of the KGB as we know it. The famous KGB that you've heard in the movies, it begins in this day after a long history from being split over by everyone, and this is the formation of the very defining Soviet penal apparatus. So, while we are at the KGB, let's talk a bit about what they did and how they did it. See, one of the main goals of this whole Soviet leadership thing was to destroy the very personal ties among private citizens and kind of create this atmosphere of distrust and fear. Everyone was just influenced by propaganda in some way or another, and there were posters and poems and movies everywhere which provided a constant reminder, a constant notice in your head that you were at all times forever surrounded by enemies constantly, and that vigilance was complete necessity of everyday life. People were really encouraged to denounce enemies whenever they felt like there was something going on there. In the last episode, I used my poem by Demian Bidny. In this poem, he expressed dismay towards enemies. He expressed hatred towards the enemies of the Soviet era, and it was quite typical of the literature in these times. See, there was also this thing that happened in the movies, and there was a musical film called The Goalkeeper, and in which this goalkeeper was encouraged to do this job in the following way, and I'm quoting here, quote, "Hey, you goalie, prepare for battle, you're a watchman by the gate. Just imagine that behind you, the borderline must be kept safe." And this also involved our famously and already known Pavlik Morozov and all sorts of poems and everything, because this is how it operated. You had to distrust everyone you knew. You had to hate those people. You had to see them as the enemies of the state. And to do this, the KGB did this, and that was their first goal why you would get arrested. And recently enough, they had incentives set up by the state for the people to denounce each other. Interestingly, they had rewards that one could potentially receive a share of whatever was confiscated by the state from your neighbor. For example, if a person lost his apartment, the denouncer could receive a part, if maybe sometimes even all of it, of the property as a reward. Another incentive to denounce others was that one could be arrested simply because one was associated with the guilty party, even if the association was just random things going on there in the background. If the accused did not report the guilty party, so to speak, he could be arrested on the basis of Article 5812. Oh, nice Article 5812. And, as usual, there were just some people who simply enjoyed denouncing their enemies. A person called Nadezhda Mendelsam, from my sources, she called these people the, quote, lovers of evil, and explains that they, quote, had a taste for the dual role. Some of them were quite famous. Ellsberg, for example. It was typical of Ellsberg that after getting his friend S sent to a concentration camp, he continued to visit S' wife and gave her advice. She knew about his role, but was frightened of betraying her disgust. And this happened kind of often. Now, when we talk about the arresting things, and this is the interesting part, see, the theory of all of this was that the procedure for arresting people in the KGB... I'm sorry, it's just my cat. I'm sorry, so in the theory, the procedure of arresting people was kinda supposed to follow a legal process, to prevent excesses kind of by the local police. The KGB was set up, in general, to, quote-unquote, prevent these excesses of the local cops. In many cases, restrictions on arrest were kind of actually observed, but during the late 1930s, the process deteriorated a lot, basically due to pressure from Stalin. And the significant increase in the number of arrests also kind of was very important to this deterioration, and the fact that you could be arrested anywhere at any time, at your house, at your workplace, on the street, picked up by a random car. Interestingly enough, I have found in my sources an American worker, John Scott, who happened to live in Magnitogorsk. And he describes arresting process, which is interesting. Quote, all arrests were made at night. Surprise was always sought for. People were arrested when they least expected it, and left for weeks when they expected every night to be taken. The arrests were made by agents having no idea of the accusations against the person being arrested. They arrived. Usually a sergeant in uniform and two plainclothesmen in an automobile, knocked at the door, politely presented an order signed by the prosecuting attorney or by the head of the city NKVD, authorizing them to search the apartment and arrest a certain person. The door was then locked. No one could come or go during the search. A civilian witness was taken at random from an adjacent apartment. He or she watched the search going on, then was requested to sign a paper stating that the authorities had not abused their power. That is, beaten up anyone or stolen anything. Everything confiscated was listed and a receipt given. The search finished, the polite and completely uncommunicative agents departed with the arrested person. Probably no one in the house, except the witness, was aware until the next morning that anything had taken place. Now, from our local KGB museum, there was also reports that people would, during these random house searches, ask, am I being accused of something, what's going on? But the official response was that, no, we can't tell you, because maybe if you're incriminated for holding something unpatriotic or very un-Soviet, such as the flag of independent Latvia or something, that would basically mean that if they would tell what you're accused of, you would then either hide or destroy the evidence while they were searching for it. In reality, however, it basically meant that, for the most part, they were just being denounced by someone, and the KGB themselves did not know for what are they looking for. But they did know that, according to 58, the famous paragraph 58, they would find something to incriminate you with in the house. Otherwise, they wouldn't have come. They didn't know what they were searching for, because, in normal societies, you have to have a warrant and you have to have a reason why you're searching a place. So even though you could have gotten nothing on you, you just... Trust me, the KGB would have figured out why to arrest you. At other times, some people, random individuals, would be called into the local NKVD headquarters, or KGB headquarters later on, because it's the same system, really. They could be asked in for questioning. These random visits were presented by the authorities as basically just a meeting, and the people in question were assured that they would not be kept for long. Since most of the people arrested were completely innocent of the crime, they fully believed that they could return quite soon once the mistake was cleared up. A certain Olga Adamova Slyozberg was a communist who lived in Moscow. She recounts her reaction when she discovered that her husband had been arrested. I opened the door and was taken aback by the smell of boots and tobacco. Marusha, her nanny, was sitting there telling the children a story in the midst of utter chaos. Heaps of books and manuscripts were scattered about the floor. Cupboards had been flung open, clothes hastily stuffed back. Underwear protruded from half-open drawers. I had no idea what had happened, but my heart froze in a dreadful promotion of misfortune. Shielding the children, Marusha got up and said in a strange, quiet voice, It's all right. Keep calm. Where's my husband? What happened? Don't you understand? They have taken him. No, it was impossible. It couldn't have happened to me, to him. Of course, there had been rumors. Just rumors by this time. It was only the beginning of 1936. That something was going on, but that there had been arrests. But surely all this applied to other people. It couldn't happen to us. I believed in the justice system of our courts. My husband would have come back, and this alien smell and topsy-turvy apartment would be no more than a dreadful memory. And this goes with a lot of people, actually. This is a common occurrence. Now, after this arrest, this newly accused person, who probably was pissed off or just afraid, they were usually taken to prison for questioning in a black car, usually called a Black Raven or Black Maria. These vehicles would often be disguised so that the public would not know how often these arrests occurred. Some were painted like delivery trucks, with bread or meat painted on the sides. And many of those who were arrested in this way, they never saw their families again. The pretexts for arrest, they varied greatly. While of course there were some common criminals who were convicted of the typical crimes like murder and theft, the purges included a political type of prisoner who might be charged with sabotage, destruction of state property, like this previously mentioned wrecking, or spying, for one, or even sometimes more, of the many perceived enemies of the state. Gulag historian Anne Applebaum, quote, "The father of Alexander Lebedь, the Russian general and politician, was twice 10 minutes late to work for his factory job, for which he received a 5-year criminal camp sentence. At the largely criminal Polyansk camp near Krasnoyarsk 26, home of one of the Soviet Union's nuclear reactors, archives record one quote-unquote criminal prisoner with a 6-year sentence for stealing a single rubber boot in a bazaar, another with 10 years for stealing 10 loaves of bread, and another, a truck driver raising 2 children alone, with 7 years for stealing 3 bottles of wine he was delivering. Yet another got 5 years for speculation, meaning he had bought cigarettes in one place and sold them in another. Antoni Eckhart tells the story of a woman who was arrested because she took a pencil from the office where she worked. It was for her son, who had been unable to do his schoolwork for the lack of something to write with." In her memoirs, Eugenia Ginsberg remembers a woman who was arrested because she told 2 political jokes. Gustav Hurdling worked in the camps with a man who had received 10 years for winning an unfortunate drunken bet that he could shoot Stalin's eye and a portrait on the wall. People were even arrested for beating a soccer team supported by somebody high up in the government. The first thing that happened to you after this arrest was that you were dragged by this car to this local NKVD or KGB office, and this is a story which is often told by the KGB museum here in Riga. You would arrive, you would be in this car, you'd be driven to the back entrance so that you don't know the layout of the land. Afterwards, you'd be just assured that, if you were innocent, then you would be kind of okay, you would be released. And then you would be told to undress completely. You'd be completely naked. And then you would hold your own clothing while being completely naked, and you would be taken up to a secret compartment in a room. Mostly these were mainly multi-floor buildings because that was more intimidating. You would be taken to an upper floor while walking the stairs completely naked. People just walking around there and being okay with this. They're working they would be just working in the place, and you'd be completely naked, and you'd be taken upstairs. And the first thing that you'd see while being taken into a chamber would be a huge knife on the table, which was used for psychological shock. Now that knife would be used to basically cut off all the buttons from the shirts and pants, and just remove all the zippers and remove all the belts and everything that you could use as a tool to harm yourself. And then you would be asked to squat, and a full cavity search would be performed on you. And after that, well, if they found something valuable on you or inside of you, they would just take that and tell you that, that this is bad and we'll go in your case. But basically this was just so you would be very much intimidated. After that, they would allow you to get dressed, but as another way of humiliating yourself, you'd get your old clothing back, but it would just not hold on to you because the belts were removed, all the buttons were removed, and everything was just removed. So you would be kind of embarrassed, and you would be holding your own clothing together just so that it would stand on you while they took the mug shots. And then they would take you to the local KGB prison to wait for some interrogations. Because, interestingly enough, the first days in this prison, they were an unbearable shock to most people. Political prisoners often receive the worst treatment in these cases, obviously. In most cases, the conditions in the prison were horrendous. The cells were so crowded there was almost no space to sleep, and even though my source, this Gulag history book, speaks in general about all of this, but I have seen the cells in Riga prison, and you walk into this small room, which is at all times brightly lit. Then you would think this room is for about 6 people. It's actually for 32, and it's kind of crazy. Anyway, a 1933 memorandum from the OGPU, which is, as I told before, the precursor of the KGB, describes the overcrowding. Basically, as a rule, police cells are overcrowded by 200 up to 400%, and sometimes up to 600, 800%. Thus, in the Moscow police detention cells built for 350 people, 2,341 were being kept as of 31st of January. As of the January number 1, in the Urals province, cells built for 470 people housed 1,715 inmates. As of 1st of January, in the Ivanovno industrial province, cells built for 19 people had 70 people, etc. And in Riga, in Riga, cells built for 15 people held 32, cells built for 6 people held 15, and so on. Instead of bathrooms, these cells had a bucket in the corner. And even this was better than in those prisons where one needed permission to be taken to the toilet. And this was interesting because you imagine these overcrowded cells, they're very, very hot. It's very, very hot in there. And you had 15 minutes per cell at each morning in 6 a.m. To actually use the bathroom. That means actually going to the bathroom and just washing yourself in the sink for a moment. And that's also the moment where the inmates would take the bucket and just pour it out. You had to hold it in yourself, otherwise the stench would be just unbearable. You also weren't allowed to actually go outside and like too much. You were let outside only once per week for some 30 minutes, and then you would have to walk around the courtyard while always looking down. There were always bright lights in these cells, and you were only allowed to sleep on your back, and if you kind of turned somehow or covered your eyes in some form, you would be waking up. That is so they could torment you more. Because otherwise, the guards told you that they had to see your face at all times. These were dreadful cells. Obviously, lice and parasites and disease ran rampant. And the stench, apparently, was so strong that the guards sometimes issued perfume to cover up the smell. And at least here in Riga, the hallways in between the cells where the guards worked were covered with very thick carpet, so that the blood would kind of just black carpet at that, so that the blood would kind of drain it in there and they wouldn't have to clean it, and that you couldn't hear when the guards were coming, so that they could just wake you up whenever you kind of fell asleep weirdly. And yeah, also the beds, no, there were no beds. There were basically mattresses were never changed. There were just some hay in what they had been in the mattresses at some point again. Just, I don't know, simple metal beds, mattresses there, and not enough room for people to actually sit down there, because you weren't allowed in the cell to speak loudly. Some people just sat down, you were just trying to speak very quietly and trying to deal with migraine that not having a good sleep or anything would give you. Food was extremely sparse there. Interestingly enough, they were given 3 meals per day, sort of, you can call them meals. In the mornings and in the evenings, you would get dark bread with tea, and I'll get to this tea later because the tea was made during the dinner time. And you see, the average meal of the prisoners at that time was just random vegetable soup. But the vegetables were never basically washed or anything. They were just, you have dirty potatoes, you just cut them up in pieces, throw them in a bucket, and then you kind of serve this up with some other vegetables which are just thrown in there from huge bags. And then that would be your soup. And your tea would basically mean that, after you pour all the soup out, you just pour water into these buckets, boil it, and then you kind of, give that to people as tea. What the Soviet KGB called tea was essentially boiled water just boiled into the buckets where the soup was being made for the dinner. And I'm not over-exaggerating, that this is actually what happened. Interestingly enough, no communication was allowed between these cells in the prison. A tapping language, quite an interesting one, was prevalent amongst the prisoners. Each letter had a certain combination of taps, and these prisoners became quite adept at kind of exchanging information in this matter, despite the various attempts of the KGB authorities to prevent it. Now, for those considered to be ideologically dangerous, a designation reserved mostly for political so-called terrorists, there were solitary confinement cells. These were typically no larger than, just a few steps in each direction, and they could get extremely, extremely cold in wintertime. But by most accounts, people could spend only a short time in these cells before losing both their health and their sanity. Interestingly enough, some of these cells were so tight and so packed up that you couldn't even squat in them. It was impossible. It was just, you could only stand there and lean against the wall, because it was literally impossible for you to even squat there, because the cell was just too narrow for that one. And you were kept in these cells just to break you down for the interrogation. And that is where the real horror started. But before the interrogation happens, let's take a short break and give a word to Alice.
Hi guys, it's Alice. Thank you for joining us. We're happy to have you. I'm glad to announce that we are slowly but surely getting on YouTube, and currently we have 15 subscribers. So if you want to support us, you can just subscribe to us. Currently, we're uploading all the previous episodes that we had until now, and by the end of October, we should be full on there. We will also be releasing trailers for each episode so that, you can get a little preview of what's going on, and send it to your friends. You can also support us by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/theeasternborder. We have monthly raffles where you can get all sorts of merch from the Soviet Union, including badges and money. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, where we post some fun stuff from the Eastern Border, from the current news about Russia, and all sorts of Soviet fun. And now, let's get back to the show. It's serious, but important.
Welcome back to the show. Now, the main purpose of these KGB prisons, or NKVD prisons, or, the system's prisons, and I'm not talking about the Gulag, I'm sorry, now, these prisons were to hold prisoners for interrogation until the Gulag, because you just couldn't grab someone on the street and send it away. You had paperwork to fill. I mean, obviously. The end goal of this interrogation was to get the prisoners to sign a confession that they had committed this certain crime. Now, normally these accusations, as you might understand by this point, were completely faked. And the prisoners, more often than not, refused to sign this document. Now, they had to do it just because, so the paperwork is clean and everything is in order, to give a veneer of legitimacy. It's kind of interesting but the Soviet authorities were obsessed with this need to obtain this written confession. In most cases, what would happen to this guy who went there was already determined, but many hours of intimidation and torture were used to force the prisoner to sign this faked-up document. It was important for propaganda reasons. See, the Soviets were the good guys, and they had to keep the workers everywhere, and the KGB agents themselves kind of ensured that we're doing the right thing. Otherwise, he wouldn't sign this thing. Obviously, one of the primary tools used by the secret police system was torture. Russian historian Oleg Khlevunik writes that, quote, Soviet punitive agents were at that time members of one of the more criminalized and brutal security services in history. In a very secret letter written to Stalin by one of the heads of the secret police, there are some of the outlines of the interrogation means. You can spot some of them there. So, quote, in relation to arrested persons who stubbornly oppose the demands of the investigator and conduct themselves in a provocative manner, and seek in all ways to drag out the investigation or to deflect it from the right path, a strict regime under guard is to be introduced. This includes the following measures. A. Transfer to a prison with more strict regime, where hours of sleep are restricted and the maintenance of the arrested person in regard to food and other domestic needs is worsened. B. Solitary confinement. C. Forbidding walks, food parcels, and the right to read books. D. Placing in a punishment cell for a period up to 20 days. End quote. Now these nice interrogators, they were masters of inflicting pain and carried it out with very increasing efficiency. I mean, see, if I would say that Gestapo learned from these guys, it kind of would mean that Gestapo overdid these guys. Actually, they're at the level of the same evil that you would imagine your Nazis being, except these are Soviets, and they fought the Nazis, so they must be the good guys, right? Right? Except, they beat the prisoners, they burned the prisoners, they froze the prisoners. They even raped their prisoners. They cut them with knives. There were special standing cells, sometimes called kishka, or the intestine, which were also used as solitary confinement ones, which are shaped like chimneys and designed specifically, like I said before, so that the person could not sit down. Every time the person collapsed, his knees would buckle and he would become painfully wedged in the cell, effectively forcing him to stand up again. In a report, the NKVD noted one instance where an interrogator, quote, knocked Kay teeth out and kicked her. As a result, he damaged her spine, and Kay could only stand on her hands and knees. This report describes another case where the prisoners, quote, head was squeezed between the steel bars of a sink, and he was beaten with sticks on his back and legs for 2 days and 2 nights. After the beating, he was put in a stance and beaten on the head with a paperweight, a bottle, a chair leg, until unconscious, and then thrown in a lockup. Basically, hygiene was non-existent. It was also used as a psychological weapon to weaken the resolve of the prisoners. They were often softened up for a week or two in a common cell where the filth would demoralize them to the point where they would submit. In at least one instance, a lice cell was used where the cell was kept at high temperature and the lice flourished by feeding of the helpless prisoners. And this is how the source presents itself. Actually, high temperatures were kept, at least as far as I know, also here in Riga, because this is like this Gulag history side, they speak about mostly Russian KGB prisons. But in Riga, they were also kept in extremely high temperatures over there. And yeah, lice were sometimes even introduced to prisoners. And they were specifically paid agents of KGB who are just, you have a cell of 30 prisoners there in the KGB prison, and one of them is Czech agent, actually. He just spends a while there and then goes back. He has to suffer for a while, but then he gets a nice vacation, huge paycheck, he suffers for a payment. And then you can't even talk within yourself, because someone might drag you down. You couldn't sleep during the day, you couldn't lay down during the day in these KGB prisons. And one night you could be taken up and interrogated all night long, and then you couldn't sleep then, and you can't sleep during the day, so you went without sleep, and then you had to stay up the whole next day. And then during the next night, they would take you again, until you signed the confession paper. That's one of the more interesting and forms of torture here. And I'm going into more creepy territory, and my creepy voice is out, because that's the way of me coping with reading you all of this from my script, and it is kind of weird for me, even when I speak about this, because even though I'm a Soviet man, I'm still a man, and it's hard to talk about all this situation going on here, especially since it has affected my own relatives. But yeah, I'm sorry for this sidetracking. Let's just carry on. See, another dreaded form of torture was the conveyor. Vladimir Terchavin, in his book, meets a fellow prisoner who recounts his experience with this system. Quote, "Picture a group about 40 prisoners, men and women, all worn out, hungry, eaten by lice, suffering from swollen legs from long standing, people who have not slept for many nights. Single file, we were led into the big room with 3 or 4 desks, and at each desk was an examining officer. Then comes another room and more examining officers, a corridor, stairs, and more rooms with more examining officers. At the command, at a run, we had to run from one desk to another, and as we approached each desk, the examining officer would start shouting at us the wildest language imaginable. This sort of torture lasted for 10 to 12 hours. Examining officers go away and rest. They get tired sitting and shouting obscenities, and so are relieved by others. But the prisoners have to keep on running." One of the more effective methods of eliciting a confession was to use the personal information about the prisoner. It was difficult for prisoners to hold out when the interrogators threatened to arrest their spouses or their children. According to official documents, it was also common practice to make, quote, "use of compromising data, which the MGB," again, the new name of NKVD, later KGB, "has at its disposal, which the latter is concealing. Sometimes, in order to outwit the arrested person and give him the impression that the agencies of the MGB know everything about him, the investigator draws the arrested person's attention to particular intimate details from his personal life, vices which he conceals from the associates and others." There were even reports of mock executions in order to get the stubborn prisoner to confess. Yeah, this happened quite often. This mock execution things, because I'm mixing stuff from stories and from a book here at this point, from various books. But mock executions happen. You would be undressed, you would be just placed a pistol in your head, and you would be kind of sort of executed, except without a real bullet. You just knew that you wouldn't die at the very last moment. It's kind of interesting, extremely weird process. It was called the ditch. The prisoners were taken to a site where others had been sentenced to be executed. The KGB officials put them, quote, "alongside those sentenced to death and started shooting those sentenced to death in their presence and threatening to shoot them if they did not confess." Obviously, in the end, most people signed the confession given to them. Although the charges were usually completely fake, some signed because the endless days of torture and confinement were just simply too much. They also felt that the outcome was inevitable and signing would just speed up the process. Others signed because they felt they were saving their loved ones. Sometimes they just forged the signature anyways. And the final act, before sending the prisoners to Gulag, was the trial itself. Not everyone was given a trial, especially after 1937, as mostly everyone was being arrested. 20% of the country, after all, sitting there. However, a large number of prisoners had their case heard in front of a troika. The famous troika I mentioned before, 3 judges, who listened to the evidence and passed down the sentence. Although the outcome was sort of known before already, that was an important moment because the prisoners would finally learn their fate. Some were taken immediately as shot. The majority received a certain number of years of hard labor in a random labor camp in a gulag, which we're going to talk about in the next episode and talked about in the previous one. There was another type of trial that was utilized for the high-profile figures called the show trial. As with other trials, the outcome of these ones was kind of there already. But the proceedings drew regional or national attention. Many of the top communists, such as Kamenev, Ryakov, and Bukharin, they all admitted in these trials to heinous crimes of sabotage and spying in front of the whole country. The same happened here in Riga, Latvia, in 1946, where 7 high-ranking Nazi officers were tried. Governors of Riga, leaders of the forces here, people here were just tried and then they were executed. The problem was, one of these 7 Nazis got so sick he couldn't be hanged. And, by the way, hangings happened in the place where we now have our World War II victory monument, built by the Soviets, because it was no victory for the Latvians, as we were just sitting there in occupation for many, many years to come. They committed crimes as Nazis, and sure, they were tried, and they had this show trial, and they were all sentenced to hang in this square. And also, many people were just forced to come and watch this hanging. It was one of the latest public executions, I suppose, known to man by this point, because a lot of people came and brought their children with them. Some people just had to come because their work dragged them to it. But the thing is, they had only 6 Nazis at the execution. The 7th one got sick and died in the hospital from a heart attack. The 7th one was just a random prisoner dragged into there in clothing and put on randomly, and we still don't know his name. Why? Because, hell, the Soviets sentenced 7 Nazis to hanging, so 7 Nazis there shall be. And it doesn't matter if the 7th wasn't a Nazi, or he probably didn't even need execution or whatever. No. We'll just dress him up in Nazi clothing and put him up and hang him with the rest. He must have done something. He must have been some rich dude or whatever. And yeah, you might think about the suicide rates there in the other interrogations during the trials, and that was one of the more favorite tactics the KGB used too. You see, these interrogations usually happened in the top floors of the building. At least here in Riga, Latvia, it happened in the 7th floor of the building, and these are one of the old Art Nouveau buildings built in the early 20th century. They're very, very elaborate and quite huge. So the interrogator would come up to you and say, "Well, you just make your life easier to me and you and your family and everyone. Just jump through that window. Jump through the window, kill yourself. We'll leave everyone alone. Less papers to sign, everything, and it's just going to be amazing. It's awesome." Then he would just leave you. And there's this big curtain in front of this window that the room has. And then you decide that, you're broken down by this point. You've been in this prison system. You've been suffering a lot. And then you go to the window and you've been taunted to jump out of the window to commit a suicide. And then you open the window, you open the curtain to the window, and you'll notice that the window has bars in front of it so that you can't kill yourself anymore. And then the interrogator comes in and says, "Oh well, only a guilty person would try to kill himself now, would it? Because for innocent people, this is just a misunderstanding. Let's keep you and torment you for a while now more here." Welcome to the Soviet Union, gentlemen. Anyway, back to the trials. These were kind of mostly scripted, as you might understand, and the prosecutor and the accused basically had roles they were supposed to fulfill. The show trials were kind of effective tools in convincing the people that corruption in their country was pervasive. Citizens were led to understand that, if the leaders of the revolution had resorted to these crimes, it was only reasonable to think that anyone might be capable of doing the same. There are many reasons why the Soviet government insisted on carrying out this shut-off of justice. Perhaps, like I said before, it gave the overall system kind of some legitimacy. And it gave the people a sense that the purges were an unfortunate but kind of necessary part of all this communist struggle. It was a dreadful time, especially for my people. And I really don't understand those who don't understand how evil the Soviet system actually was. I cannot justify the crimes the Soviets did, and I cannot stand for anyone who is being a Marxist in this day and age. Because these guys were fanatical Marxists, and make no mistake, even Marx himself wrote about armies of workers and children being taken away from their families to be raised in the communal barracks, and the workers being assigned orders and they being strictly organized, even though he had never worked in his life and he was under this rich person Engels who basically fed him, rich factory owner, exploitator by socialist standards. Socialism and communism are weird things, and this is not a political show normally. But there are some things which are just wrong. I mean, social democracy is one thing. Sharing with other people your wealth is nice. Yeah, but if someone tries to enforce utter equality and take away the stuff that you have earned and try to make sure that you are completely equal, not only in chances and rights, but in everything that other people, then, you better take a look at this. We are kind of egoists now, aren't we? And, sorry for being kind of emotional here, but yeah, I'm talking about stuff that has affected my people and especially my family here. And this is as much as I can do for this episode. See you next time when we shall, once again, hope to finish the story about gulags. Maybe we won't, maybe we will. I don't know. It's getting harder and harder for me to produce these. And yeah, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, support us on Patreon. До свидания, товарищ. And until next time.
Thank you for listening to The Eastern Border. If you have any comments or specific details you'd like to know, you're welcome to leave it in the comment section on our site, theeasternborder.lv, and we'll rummage even to the western border to find you an answer. Like this podcast, subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or on our RSS feed. Happiness is mandatory. Good reviews and donations feed the farmers of our kolkhozs in the great motherland. The Eastern Border salutes you.